that showing up okay? Showing up okay?
It looks great, and I just
Okay,
turned on the recording.
okay. So good morning, everyone.
Good
I'm
morning.
going to speak with you all for the next few minutes about some work that we've been involved with, primarily dealing with the American horseshoe crab, but I'll touch on some work that with collaborators from Asia as well. So, as Meredith mentioned, I'm now Professor Emeritus at Fordham University and also involved with the IUCN Horseshoe Crab Specialist Group, and I'll tell you some more about that as we go along. So, as a brief overview, I'll talk first about the ecology of horseshoe crabs, some of their commercial uses, some of the current and future threats to their populations, and then toward the end, touch on some international conservation issues. So horseshoe crabs are interesting animals in a number of ways, and one of them is their mode of reproduction. They're one of the few marine animals that actually comes and spawns in the intertidal zone, and this is a typical spawning concentration of horseshoe crabs. Happens to be from Jamaica Bay in New York City. The animals come ashore and lay their eggs in the sand, and here's a picture of a cluster of eggs, roughly 4,000 eggs per cluster, and the females can lay multiple clusters during the course of the spawning season. The season itself varies depending on the latitude. So in the mid-Atlantic states, spawning tends to peak in May and June. If you go up to New England, it's a little bit later in the year, and if you're down in the Florida area, they spawn over a much longer period of time. Uh, the eggs, as we'll talk about later on, are deposited in the sand by the animals, but a wave action and the digging of other horseshoe crabs tends to bring these eggs to the surface of the beach, where they often aggregate in large numbers, and this proves to be an important food source for migratory shorebirds, as many of them uh, will overwinter in South America and then have certain refueling stops, such as Delaware Bay, before they gain weight again and make that final leg of the journey up to the Arctic where they breed. After a couple of weeks of development in the sand, you get these amazing, beautiful embryos. These are maybe about 3 weeks after development, just before hatching, and they look very similar to just miniaturized horseshoe crabs. And then this is the larval stage, sometimes referred to as the trilobite stage, which hatches out roughly a month or 5 weeks after the eggs were laid. But from that point on, they have to molt. Like all arthropods, they have an exoskeleton, which they have to shed in order to further their growth. So this is the old shell on top, and you see the new animal emerging from the front end. And they'll do this multiple times in the first couple of years, and ultimately continuing this successive molt for about 10 years until they reach full size at sexual maturity. Why should we be interested in horseshoe crabs? There are a number of reasons, and I'll discuss in brief some of the ecological as well as commercial reasons why horseshoe crabs have some importance. So one fact which is fairly well known among zoologists is that they are long time survivors, have been around since before the dinosaurs, and emerging in a very similar body plan. You see this fossil specimen from Poland, which has a very similar morphology to our modern horseshoe crab. But that's a relative youngster in the fossil record. Here's one of the oldest known fossils collected in northern Canada, and this dates to about 445 million years ago. So very early on in the fossil record, they developed a body plan which is fundamentally similar to the modern horseshoe crab shape. Some other curiosities, perhaps, are their eyesight, which is very different than the retinal eye of vertebrates, but nonetheless, they see quite well. They have these two large lateral eyes, and they can actually see very well in both daylight and at night. And H.K. Hartline won a Nobel Prize for his pioneering work on horseshoe crab vision. Horseshoe crabs have a wide variety of foods that they eat, primarily things like clams and marine worms. But what is maybe not so well known is that they're also edible. I haven't ever tried them myself, but I'm told by my colleagues in Southeast Asia that they can be pretty good eating. I don't know that from personal experience, though. There are a number of threats to horseshoe crab populations that I'd like to speak with you about. And these fall into four basic categories. First, there are the commercial uses, primarily biomedical use and bait in the US, and biomedical and human consumption in Asia, habitat loss and degradation, water pollution, and being entrapped in fishing nets and other type of gear. Some of you may know about the story of horseshoe crab blood and its role in biomedical processes. Here you see a picture of a technician taking blood from a horseshoe crab or a series of horseshoe crabs. And the first thing you notice is that the blood is blue. And that's because they have a copper-based blood pigment called hemocyanin. You and I have red blood from an iron-based pigment called hemoglobin. The blood cells, the whole blood then is centrifuged, and the blood cells are separated from the liquid or plasma portion, and then a product called LAL, stands for limulus amoebocyte lysate, is then obtained from the cells. But why is this useful? It turns out that this material, LAL, is the basis of a sensitive test for bacterial contamination. And what happens is that bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, have materials, chemicals on their cell walls called endotoxins. And horseshoe crab blood can be used or is used to test for the presence of endotoxin. And the way it works is that you have a liquid or substance that you want to test, you mix it with LAL, and if there is a bacterial contaminant, the blood or the residual will form a clot, as you see here, and the actual tube here. Whereas if the material is free of bacterial contamination, if there's no endotoxin, then the solution stays as a liquid. So this is the basis for testing all sorts of materials, and everybody who is watching and well, your colleagues would have the safety of their medications or intravenous fluids or implantable medical devices. They all have to be tested because you don't want to insert material that has bacteria into a patient. So all the materials that could go into a human body are tested for the presence of bacterial contamination with the use of this LAL test. From the standpoint of the horseshoe crabs, although the process looks somewhat gruesome to take the blood from the crabs, they're actually very hardy animals, and it's been shown that about 85% or more of the horseshoe crabs that are bled will in fact survive the process. So there's another way to look at it is there's about a 15% mortality. Recently, a test developed by a colleague, Dr. Ji-Lik Ding in Singapore, has developed a test based on recombinant proteins, or proteins derived by recombinant DNA. And that would be a test that will soon go into more widespread use. It's just been approved recently by the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, the agency that ensures these tests are accurate, and they've determined now that this is a suitable substitute for the use of the horseshoe crab blood. So if this test becomes more widely accepted, it would reduce the demand for horseshoe crab bodies to be donated for blood. Another use for horseshoe crabs, one which I guess happily no longer is part of the scene, is grinding up horseshoe crabs for fertilizer. This was at one point a pretty big industry based in Delaware Bay, Delaware and New Jersey. And the last of these fertilizer factories is shown here. This was the last one on the Bay Shore from circa 1930, and massive numbers of horseshoe crabs were collected from the Delaware Bay and ground up into fertilizer and chicken feed and poultry feed. And this industry no longer operates, but it sort of set a pattern of a massive decimation of the population, which took decades to recover. Now, today, horseshoe crabs are used as bait, chopped up and put into traps to catch eels and these large snails known as whelks. For a while, the bait industry was unregulated. Back in the 1970s and early 80s and 90s, there was no regulations preventing fishermen from taking unlimited numbers of horseshoe crabs. And it wasn't until 1998 that regulations at the federal level took effect through the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which controls the Atlantic coast fisheries from Maine to the Atlantic coast of Florida. And ASMFC, as it's known for short, sets landings, maximum quotas for each of the states in its jurisdiction. And what you see here is a trend line showing that in the late 90s, this is the bait fishery, over 2.5 million horseshoe crabs a year taken principally from Delaware Bay, but not exclusively, but largely from the Delaware Bay area. And once ASMFC's regulations took effect, you see that collection of horseshoe crabs is now down to about 500,000 per year. The yellow line shows the biomedical collections, the number estimated to be bled, and then the assumption is that of those which are collected, about 15% will not survive. And so that's the little green line, the biomedical mortality. And you notice that that's a much smaller number compared with the bait fishery. So ASMFC has sort of been controlling the fishery for horseshoe crabs since 1998. Now, turning to another threat, there's the damaging effects of shoreline hardening, or attempts to control erosion, some of which are legal, some of which are not legal. Here are two very extreme examples. On the left, a small town in Delaware Bay. I think, if I remember, this one is called Moores Beach. And this was just illegal fill that was dumped here. Jamaica Bay, New York, there's a highway. You can maybe just at the top see this is a major highway along Jamaica Bay in Brooklyn, and to prevent the road from collapsing, these sandbags were put in place to protect the road. So these are all areas that would have otherwise been good horseshoe crab spawning habitat, but are now unsuitable. A big factor which is still being contemplated in terms of its effect is the potential for sea level rise, which is very much with us. There are a number of different models that project different rates of sea level rise, depending on all sorts of assumptions, which we don't need to dwell on. But even the more conservative projections of sea level rise would suggest on the order of a half meter to almost a meter by the year 2100. And as sea level rise takes place, that puts more pressure to protect coastal properties, leading to perhaps more construction of seawalls and things of that sort. Again, taking away from habitat that would have otherwise been suitable for horseshoe crabs to spawn. Another threat, which I want to briefly talk about and then transition into some specific research, is the potential effects of pollution. Now, our lab has done a number of studies looking at the effects of pollutants on horseshoe crab eggs and embryos. We've tested varieties of heavy metals, organic compounds, and such. And it turns out that these embryos, eggs and embryos, are very tolerant compared to most other marine invertebrate larvae. These guys are really tough. Maybe that helps explain why they've been around for 445 million years, but that's an aside. And we've also done some experiments looking at the ability of these embryos to survive changes in temperature and salinity. So they really tend to be pretty tough. However, there is potential for other things to cascade from that tolerance to pollution. And I want to briefly talk about something that's really become a major issue with marine pollution, and that is the problem of plastic pollution. Now, a lot of us are familiar with, unfortunately, along the coast, scenes like this where we see plastic debris washed up all over the place. Plastics are found not only on beaches where they're visible, but on the ocean floor bottom and so forth. Now, some of these larger plastics over time can degrade into what are called microplastics, particles that are less than 5 millimeters in size, or nanoplastics, which are even an order of magnitude smaller, or 2 orders of magnitude smaller. And this is an emerging field in marine biology. What's the occurrence of microplastics, and what effects do they have on biological systems? So in our one of our projects that I did with students at Fordham was we wanted to see whether or not horseshoe crab eggs could contain or did contain microplastics, and could they be transmitted in the process of feeding by migratory shorebirds. Whoops, sorry, I went to. So my undergrad student, Royal, we collected unfertilized eggs. This is showing a female, and it shows the location where the eggs can be released. And if a female is ready to spawn, all you really have to do is turn her upside down and gently massage the area around the gonopores, and these eggs will come out and you can collect them. And we know they're unfertilized at that point. We can also collect eggs from the beaches where the females have been depositing eggs, and we know those are fertilized eggs because she will only deposit the eggs when a male is present. So that's how we collected the eggs. And then another student, Emily Casper, who was a master's student, collected shorebird fecal pellets. So what Emily was able to do is sort of have a bird blind, an area where the birds don't see you because they tend to be, frightened of human presence. You let them feed for a period of time, and as they're feeding, they're also pooping, and you go out after the birds have left, and you can collect the shorebird fecal pellets. We then took the samples of both eggs and fecal pellets and stained them with a dye called Nile red. Uh, Nile red will cause microplastic particles to fluoresce when you use a special microscope called a fluorescence scope. And so we found several types of materials, including just these small irregular particles, as well as the more obvious and distinctive microfibers, many of which, by the way, are derived from clothing, from polyester type fabrics. Um, and we were able to show that there were microplastics in just about everything that we looked at. We found microplastics in the fertilized eggs, unfertilized eggs, and the shorebird fecal pellets, more in the eggs than in the fecal pellets, as it turned out. So we did a little bit of a back of the envelope calculation based on what we know as the amount of microplastics per unit weight of eggs, and knowing how many eggs it takes to have a gram of eggs. We estimate there are about 6 microplastic particles in each egg. Now, other researchers working in the Delaware Bay area have estimated that the shorebirds can eat upwards of 8,000 eggs per day. So again, if you kind of work through the math, if we know how many eggs, microplastics are in an egg, we know roughly can estimate how many eggs are eaten, and we know that the birds tend to spend about 2 to 3 weeks stopover before they continue the journey up to the Arctic. You end up rather quickly with a large number of microplastics that the shorebirds could be eating during the time that they're foraging in the estuaries in the mid-Atlantic. However, the big unknown at this point is, so we don't know what the effects of microplastics are on the health of either the shorebirds or the horseshoe crabs. So just because the shorebirds are ingesting a large quantity of microplastics, we're not really sure at this point, is it having a harmful effect? And from what we can tell anyway, the development of the eggs, at least in the area where we studied, almost all the eggs develop normally. So it doesn't appear to have a harmful effect on horseshoe crab egg development, but I wouldn't want to dismiss the possibility altogether. In the closing time I have, I'd like to talk a little bit with you about some of the work that we've done with international collaborators. And this is an example of how research collaboration across the world really benefits everybody. For a long time, US researchers were sort of working in a silo, and Asian researchers in their own silo, and it's only relatively recently that we have international collaboration for mutual benefit. In Asia, we have 3 species of horseshoe crabs, which range from the southern portion of Japan uh, over to the Bay of Bengal in India and Bangladesh. There are three species. Some areas have only a single species, such as Japan and northern China. Other areas, there's overlap between two, and in some cases, like Indonesia, there are actually areas where you can find all three horseshoe crab species co-occurring. So there are certain threats that are common to horseshoe crabs everywhere. I mentioned in the U.S. we have fishing of horseshoe crabs for the bait industry and biomedical industry. The biomedical industry in Asia works differently. They are not required to release the crabs back into the bay after they collect them. So generally what happens is the animals are bled thoroughly, and then after that, the meat is extracted and sold for food. And sometimes, as you see here, the animals are served whole. So that's one aspect of the concern for Asia. Coastal development is yet another concern. I mentioned and showed a few pictures of shoreline construction in the U.S. Here's the typical seawalls that you see in Japan. Most of the coast is not the natural shoreline, but has these long embankments. And this, interestingly, is actually a horseshoe crab conservation area. This tiny little artificially maintained beach is a popular place for people to come and observe horseshoe crabs. There's actually an elderly gentleman that lives across the street who comes out every morning with a rake and cleans the beach to make it as nice as possible for the horseshoe crabs. Another example of shoreline development are these massive shrimp ponds that you see in much of Southeast Asia. These are areas that at one time might have been suitable spawning areas for Asian horseshoe crabs, but obviously with this construction are no longer a viable habitat. We also have a major problem in Asia of ghost net fishery bycatch and ghost nets. Here you see two pictures just of many that I've been sent where you get these entanglements of horseshoe crabs in these nets, and then ultimately they're likely to die unless somebody comes along to rescue them. So in terms of international collaboration, one of the main things that's been a driver for this is the IUCN, or International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and we formed a Horseshoe Crab Specialist Group in 2012. And there are many, many groups within this large organization dealing with all sorts of plants and vertebrate and invertebrate species. And we're part of this much larger organization called the Species Survival Commission of the IUCN. And one of the things that the IUCN does is review evidence to determine whether a species is at low risk or moderate risk or high risk of extinction. So the higher up you go on this chart, the worse off you are in terms of the species status. So what we did, at least initially, was focus on trying to evaluate the status of the American horseshoe crab, which prior to 2016 was listed as vulnerable, which listed as least concern, And as a result of the work of our team, we were able to get that upgraded to a status of vulnerable. Then we turned our attention to what we perceived as the species of Asian horseshoe crabs in the worst shape in terms of its population. That's a species called the tri-spine horseshoe crab, and that was reassessed in 2018. It had previously been data deficient, which is sort of no man's land, and as a result of the efforts of our team, this is now categorized as an endangered species. And then the two remaining Asian horseshoe crab species are currently data deficient, but we have teams in place working on the assessments. And again, this is a laborious process where you have to look at all sorts of data, such as it is for published and unpublished data. And one of the problems is that we found is that there often is not a long-term data that allows you to determine trends over long periods of time. It wasn't like there were people out 50 years ago doing surveys. So sometimes it's challenging to try to determine the species status. Now, it's important to recognize that being on the IUCN Red List in any category doesn't guarantee protection, but what it does is inform the local governmental agencies of the risk of extinction of a particular species, which then gives greater credibility to conservation efforts. In other words, if a species is data deficient, it's hard to go to the government and say, oh, you need to protect this species because we think it should be protected. You're in a lot stronger position if you can say, we need to have some regulations because it's endangered on the IUCN Red List. So it's an important step toward conservation, but it's not a guarantee of protection yet. So what is our specialist group working on these days? So we are continuing to have teams work on the population status, threats, and trends for all 4 species of horseshoe crabs, with an eye toward updating the red list, particularly for the 2 species that are still data deficient. We also work to organize scientific meetings and increase public awareness about horseshoe crabs. And we are also drafting what's called a Conservation Action Plan for Asian horseshoe crabs. This is different than the assessment because what we're doing here is saying, okay, what measures could be undertaken to promote the conservation of horseshoe crabs, primarily in Southeast Asia. So this is just a couple of slides from our most recent meeting, which we had about a year ago in Singapore. We had about 125, 130 scientists from around the world, and a really important event toward fostering community collaboration and leading us toward these red list assessments and the conservation action planning. Horseshoe Crab Specialist Group also helps to promote public education and citizen science efforts. So we have a very active group in India, as you see here, a really great program through Ocean Park Conservation Foundation, Hong Kong, and City University of Hong Kong, where in the laboratories of the City University of Hong Kong, they raise juvenile horseshoe crabs and then give them out as study animals to local schools. The school children raise the animals in their labs, and then when they get to a certain size, they then have these release events. So it's a great way to promote public awareness of horseshoe crabs in Hong Kong. Ghost net rescues are important. Here's an example of one such effort in Malaysia, and there's similar efforts going on in Singapore and Indonesia and many other countries where horseshoe crabs often get entangled in these ghost nets. In the U.S., there are major programs, particularly centered in Delaware Bay, but I've seen examples of this elsewhere, where teams of volunteers go out and rescue stranded horseshoe crabs. It's very common for horseshoe crabs to get flipped on their backs during spawning, and they struggle to get right side up. And many thousands of them would die if they're left on their backs like this. So teams in New Jersey, led by an organization called Return the Favor, and in Delaware through the ERDG, they go out to beaches during the spawning season and rescue thousands of these horseshoe crabs, which would otherwise die from stranding. There's also a major coastwide effort to tag horseshoe crabs, as we see here. An effort that we did in Jamaica Bay, Brooklyn, but this goes on all along the coast. And this gives us insights into migrations of horseshoe crabs, a sense of whether there are certain estuaries where populations are contributing individuals to nearby populations, gives us a number of other insights. So this is something which, again, is strictly a volunteer effort led by a number of teams up and down the East Coast of the U.S. So in conclusion, all horseshoe crab populations have some degree of threat. Human exploitation, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation are some of the examples of threats that are common to populations both in the U.S. and in Asia. We have, I think, overall a fairly strong regulatory process for the fisheries in the horseshoe crab fisheries in the U.S. So our populations here are regulated by Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. So there are annual quotas and other limitations on the numbers of horseshoe crabs that can be caught. However, it's important that we continue to monitor the health of these populations. So if needed, stricter regulations might be imposed. So ASMFC looks at population trends on an annual basis and may either strengthen the regulations, or if the population were recovering, it could theoretically loosen them. But again, it's a review process that's under a good, sound scientific management. I don't think we're quite as far along in the conservation of Asian horseshoe crabs. It's taken some very positive steps in the past couple of decades, but it still, I think, is a work in progress. So with that, I'd like to thank some of the many people who I've worked with and continue to work with the horseshoe crab work. Christina Colon and Bob Loveland have been my primary collaborators for the work in Delaware Bay and Jamaica Bay. Emily and Royal were the two students who did the microplastics project, and Alma Rodanis helped us through the complexities of the fluorescence microscopy. My many colleagues on the Horseshoe Crab Specialist Group, primarily Dr. Paul Shin, who's the other co-chair, and then our recent funding from Sea Grant, Hudson River Foundation, and the Indianapolis Zoo. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was absolutely amazing. If anyone has any questions for our speaker, feel free to unmute, raise your hand, drop them in the chat. I'll give a couple minutes before I jump in with some of the questions that were asked over the Google form. So feel free to unmute, turn on your video camera, however you prefer to ask a question. And thank you so much, Mark. That was amazing. It was wonderful hearing more about your work, especially overseas. I had very limited knowledge of anything on a global scale. That was really amazing.
Thank you.
All right. So Haley asks, do the different species of horseshoe crabs have different spawning requirements?
There are three species, or two of the Asian species that are similar to what American horseshoe crabs do, and that the preference is to spawn on sandy beaches, sandy bay beaches. The fourth species, which we call the mangrove horseshoe crab, actually has a somewhat different spawning habitat. As the name suggests, they go up into the muddier stretches of the mangrove creeks. So they are different. They still spawn intertidally, but their sediment preference is more for muddy mangrove creeks, whereas the other three species prefer sandier texture.
I think this ties in really well to one of the questions that we got over a form, which is for the habitat, for the nesting preferences, when the horseshoe crabs are choosing a sandier beach, we were reading that it's most often in a beach that is overshadowed by vegetation and has a lot of plant material. Is that something that they can use to help flip themselves over? Is that as a way to control the temperature of the egg clutches? Are they doing that to avoid predators?
Um, I haven't really noticed that phenomenon. I think, ideal if you had a natural, unaltered beach, then chances are, what you would have is a beach and then behind it some sand dune type of environment. But there are relatively few of those left anywhere that I've seen. Again, people like to live by coastal areas, so, you know, a lot of these areas are no longer pristine, even in parts, I mean, there are parts of Delaware Bay that are very remote. I mean, one thinks about New Jersey, and you have the image of whatever construction zones and whatever, but parts of Delaware Bay are very remote, but there still are small towns along the bay shore, and much of the original vegetation isn't there anymore. As far as any issue related to selecting temperature, I think that's more a function of the position up the beach, down the beach. In other words, there's a beach gradient from low tide to high tide. High tide tends to be too hot and dry. Low tide tends to be overly wet. And so most of the eggs are actually laid toward the midpoint of the beach where they sort of get the sweet spot where it's, not too dry, but not too wet. And their temperature tolerance is pretty high.
Wow, cool. Thank you. Kylie wants to know, Kylie says, thank you so much for being here today. It seems like there's a large difference between fertilized and unfertilized eggs in terms of microplastics. Could you speak on why that might be? Are you interested in looking at microplastics in sperm?
The short answer is that result never made sense to us. That I think it's one of these, you know, instances where there's a statistical difference between the two, but I'm not sure it has any biological significance. Because to me, it didn't make sense where how can you lose egg microplastics after being fertilized? So it didn't make sense, and we sort of, mulled it over multiple times, and it just didn't seem to make sense to me why that difference should occur. And I forgot the second part of the question.
It was, are you interested in looking at microplastics in sperm?
Oh, I'd be interested in having somebody else look at that. Being as I'm retired now, I'm not in the lab as I once was. But that's a good question. I mean, I don't know why why wouldn't there be? Um, but it'd be a worthwhile project for somebody to try to do.
And then I have another question, fairly similar to this from the form again, that's asking if you know about microplastic content in Asian horseshoe crab populations, whether or not there's been research done in that.
Yeah, there was one study, and it was they didn't look at eggs, as I remember. They were looking at a total body, tissue, and similar to us, I think they found microplastics in every juvenile horseshoe crab that they examined. But I don't think anybody's looked at microplastics in Asian horseshoe crab eggs. Um, but I suspect, and I'm just speaking off the cuff, I think you probably end up finding that there are microplastics in pretty much everything that's in the ocean at this point.
Makes sense to me, as sad as it is.
Yeah.
Desiree wants to know, is there a particular conservation group you'd suggest donating to?
Oh. I'll put it in the chat. I mean, I think the main organization here in the States is called ERDG, or short for Ecological Research and Development Group, and they're based in Delaware, and they do a lot for horseshoe crab conservation, and they're a nonprofit. Um, I'll put that in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, everything I was finding with horseshoe crabs, at least that wasn't, a published paper that was more general access. So it's ERDG, their website's fantastic. And they sell hats that have just flip 'em on them. If you guys haven't seen those, they're pretty cool.
I have one. I almost wore it.
Oh, they're great. I just ordered one. I can't wear my sweater in Tucson, but I can wear my horseshoe crab hat. So Rory's asking about microplastics. You mentioned micro and nanoplastic studies on horseshoe crab development. Are you aware of any work looking at the impact of plastic leachates? Additionally, while plastics didn't significantly impact development, has there been any work on the later stages of life, such as impacts on reproductive success?
I don't know of any research on either of those topics. It's still, a relatively emerging field. I had a graph, I didn't show it, but I plotted the number of published papers on microplastics as a function of time, starting in like 1980 and going to the present. And it's, the typical, exponential growth rate, so it's still, at least for horseshoe crabs, studies on the effects of plastics or leachates or nanoplastics. This is pretty new stuff, and I'm only aware of a couple papers uh, that have looked at, you know, markers of physiological stress, for example, because an effect could be a sublethal effect, and the results are not, that they're it's not like an immediate smoking gun sort of thing, where yes, you'll find effects, but they're somewhat subtle. And I think, if you're looking for examples of animals that are likely to be highly susceptible to microplastic pollution, horseshoe crabs are probably not the ones that are going to be most susceptible. Because, I mean, we've treated these embryos and eggs with relatively high concentrations of other kinds of pollutants, and they just shrug it off. I mean, they seem not to be affected by a lot of contaminants. Now, that isn't to say we should just dump all sorts of stuff in the ocean because it's not going to harm horseshoe crabs, because it's going to harm other sorts of animals that are more vulnerable. But to address the specific question, no, I don't know of any studies on those specific points.
So I guess if there are any future horseshoe crab biologists currently on this call, they might have an interesting research direction to go in now. Nadia has posted in the chat, hello, wildlife biologist and animal welfare scientist from Canada here. I'm curious to know if there has been any work done on horseshoe crab welfare at all. Humane slaughter methods or improvements to captive housing conditions, ability to feel pain. Welfare science in non-mammals and birds is emerging, so just curious to know if any work has been done.
I know there are studies, people who've worked on trying to optimize conditions for horseshoe crabs raised in captivity, um, because there seem to be issues, nutritional issues, with keeping them in aquaria for relatively long periods of time. They seem not to thrive in captivity for lengthy periods of time, and that's been linked to the idea that they may not be getting the right kinds of foods or whatever. I'm not particularly familiar with that. As far as humane treatment, I can't speak to that because I think the whole, as you questioner asked, you know, studying whether a horseshoe crab, you know, senses pain or something like that is difficult to assess with an animal whose behaviors and nervous system is so different from ours. So I can't really, offer a intelligent comment about that.
I think a lot of the studies currently on insect welfare, especially working with more charismatic insects, are coming to similar conclusions. It's really difficult with invertebrates. So then Kylie asks, offshore wave break structures seem to be an alternative way to wave breaks placed on beaches, but do they still have a negative impact on habitat and movement for horseshoe crabs when they are offshore?
There's actually been some work on that in Long Island Sound, using, I guess the term is like living shorelines, putting structures adjacent to the beach that buffer the wave activity and allow for the sand on the beach to remain in place. And as long as you put gaps between the structures that the crabs can move through, then they seem not to have a negative effect. There's a beneficial effect from being able to protect the beach. And as long as they're, I'm kind of waving my hands around in a way that doesn't make sense, but you have a series of, reef balls or something like that. And as long as you leave sufficient gaps between the reef balls, the crabs will move through or around them and get to the beach to spawn. So yes, that's probably a preferred approach rather than putting rubble on the beach itself, which is just going to destroy the habitat.
Okay, thank you. That's really great. Then Rory asks, and I think this might come from the Bill Sargent's book, and learning about policy for horseshoe crab conservation in the late, 20th century. But Rory asks, do we know how common and impactful poaching / illegal capture of horseshoe crab is?
Is this referring to the US or other
Um,
countries?
Rory, do you have a clarification there?
Yeah, I would say generally, I'm just curious about it. I went to school in Maine, and the first time I went to find horseshoe crabs, I actually encountered some very concerning illegal capture happening with some lines and ended up having to cut a ton of horseshoe crabs out of fishing lines. So I was just curious how much of that is like a one-off situation versus something
Yeah.
that occurs frequently.
I think it does occur with some frequency. Um, Again, it's hard to document. Um, there have been some pretty well publicized cases of poaching that were caught in Jamaica Bay in Brooklyn, uh, where people go out at night after dark, load up their skiff with 50 or 100 horseshoe crabs and sell them for bait. They can get, you know, horseshoe crab for bait can fetch, $3 to $5 or so. The females usually get a little bit more because they're bigger. Um, so it does occur, but I mean, for every poacher that is caught, how many are out there that do it and don't get caught? So I don't know. I don't want to speculate on the magnitude of poaching, but it certainly occurs. And it occurs a lot in Asia too, where the regulations are not as strict and maybe not as well enforced. So, there are lots of horseshoe crabs from Malaysia that find their way to Thailand, or horseshoe crabs from Vietnam that find their way into the fish markets in China. So we know about this. One of my colleagues from the specialist group is working to try to document the extent of illegal fishing in Asia. So I do think it's a problem worthy of concern.
Thank you so much. Mark, I know we're coming up on time here, but would you have time for two more brief questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
So Ariane asks, I was wondering how to make people care about horseshoe crabs in areas where they are not part of the native ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a hard question because that people probably will be more focused on horseshoe crab conservation in areas that are part of the natural range. If you're European and you don't have any horseshoe crabs in Europe, it's not likely to motivate you, perhaps. I think horseshoe crabs also, uh, you know, people's conservation interests often tend to focus on the cute and cuddly creatures, the pandas and the manatees and so forth. And invertebrate conservation, we don't have the most aesthetically charismatic species in horseshoe crabs. So I'd be happy to hear if anybody's got any good ideas about trying to increase public awareness. I think the hook with horseshoe crabs is really, I think, linked to the biomedical importance. So if you're in a country that doesn't have horseshoe crabs, your drugs are still going to be tested with the reagent from horseshoe crab blood. So, I mean, we sort of increase awareness through that, but again, I think the organizations concerned with horseshoe crabs are going to probably be focused on the parts of the world where they exist in the natural range. I mean, it'd be not, I'm sure that it'd be fun for you to go to an aquarium in Europe and see a horseshoe crab and say, what the heck is that? But, um, you know, I think we're having a hard enough time getting public consciousness raised just in the areas of the US and in Asia. It'd be a struggle, maybe one worth doing, but it's a ways away to do it worldwide, I think.
Well, Mark, just so you know, you might be happy about this. There are people in India, England, and South America who are currently in this chat listening.
Oh,
So there
fascinating.
are people who are in those continents, those areas, those countries who
Yeah.
have horseshoe crab sweaters now and are now much better informed about horseshoe crabs. So I think I want to ask a final question. And this is one of my questions, which is you've been working with horseshoe crabs for over 40 years, and a lot of us aspire to working with the model organisms, the creatures that we love for that long. And I want to know how you fell in love with horseshoe crabs and why you love them. Because to us, they're all very charismatic, but I would love to hear how you
Well,
became fascinated.
I'll try to give you the short version here because really when I uh, started my graduate work at the Rutgers Field Station in Delaware Bay was uh, May of 1977, and that when I went down there, I had no particular interest. I knew what they were, wasn't something I was say, oh, I must study them. And as it happened, that first week or so that I was in the Delaware Bay area, there was a big film crew with David Attenborough, who I'm sure most of you guys are well familiar with, you know, Sir David Attenborough's numerous documentaries. So he was down there doing the documentary, getting some footage of horseshoe crabs for Life on Earth, which was one of his, you know, really amazing series. So, I was sort of this new graduate student saying, well, geez, well, here are these big time people came all the way from England to film horseshoe crabs. Why are they so interested in horseshoe crabs? I didn't know any better. So I was chatting with the man, Carl Schuster was his name, who was the scientific consultant for this particular part of the Life on Earth series. And Carl and I spent several days on the beach just, watching the horseshoe crab spawn. And he really was the one who motivated me, sort of asked a whole bunch of questions, because he had studied horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay in the 40s and hadn't really, followed up. He had a variety of other uh, positions and said, well, I guess he found somebody who he felt could carry on some of his work with horseshoe crabs and bring it up to a more modern time. So I like to say if I had come to the field station a week later when the BBC guys had left and Attenborough's back in England, I might never have gone in this direction. I might have studied oysters or clams or something else instead. So it's really, coincidence, a happy coincidence.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That is an absolutely wonderful story. I just thank you so much for coming to speak with us. Thank you so much for all of your work and your continued advocacy for these animals. I'm so thrilled that we were able to hear more about them. And thank you for letting me record this so that I can share it with the few people who very regretfully could not make it here with us today. Thank you
It's been a
so,
pleasure.
so much.
Nice to see you and nice to talk to all you guys about horseshoe crabs. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend. Okay, bye everyone.